Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier. You might well get a question in your exam on the aims of the big three, and if it's a question B, it could either focus on their individual aims or else ask you to compare their aims, for example, why they differed. In this presentation, I'll suggest you step back and first think about their different experiences, which led to them having different views of both what had happened and how the future order should look, so giving them different aims. Georges Clemenceau and France were aware that Germany was stronger than France, and only likely to get stronger if something wasn't done to prevent it. Germany's economy was stronger. It had a much bigger population, which meant more workers, more consumers, more taxpayers, and potentially more soldiers. Germany had easily defeated France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 that had finally united Germany and had taken Alsace-Lorraine from France. And it had pushed the French forces back again in 1914, causing a partial evacuation of Paris. In World War I, many French lives, more than 1.25 million, had been lost, with 3 times that number wounded, and almost half that number severely wounded, so that the total killed and wounded was almost 6 million people. French towns and villages, as well as farmland and mines, had all been destroyed in the course of the war. As for the present, France not only shared a long border with Germany, but it was a border without a natural barrier like a major river or a high mountain range. Hardly surprising then, the French viewed Germany with a mixture of hatred and fear, and revenge and security were high on the French agenda. So Clemenceau saw the peace conference as an opportunity to cripple Germany, and he demanded a harsh treaty. The French wanted the return of Alsace-Lorraine, of course, but it also wanted the Saar Basin, rich in coal and iron ore, transferred to France. Ideally, it would have wanted the Rhineland for itself, but it at least wanted it to be made an independent state, though dependent on France, so that France would no longer share a border with Germany. President Poincaré had wanted to go further and have Germany broken up into a number of smaller states, but that was never going to happen. And it wanted most of Germany's colonies too. It wanted Germany to disarm to a level at which it could not possibly be a threat. Finally, it wanted reparations to be paid. Indeed, it wanted a considerable sum, and it wanted payments to start immediately. As for the League of Nations, Clemenceau saw such a body as primarily another means to keep Germany in check, and as such, the French felt the League would need to have an army of its own. But what Clemenceau and the French people wanted was too extreme and unacceptable to Lloyd George and President Wilson. The French were unable to distance themselves from the emotions the war had understandably evoked. The French could only look back, whilst Lloyd George and Wilson, though not forgetting what had happened, were trying to look to the future. So that both Lloyd George and President Wilson spent much of their time arguing with Clemenceau and trying to ensure a more balanced agreement. Britain had also lost too many lives in the war. It had not been invaded, but it had been bombed by Zeppelins, and coastal towns had been bombarded by ships. Its shipping had been attacked too by unrestricted submarine warfare, in contradiction to international conventions. Its economy, particularly its ability to trade, and Britain's wealth was based on trade, had been badly affected. So Lloyd George, like Clemenceau, was aware of public pressure to make Germany pay. Lloyd George also wanted to protect British interests, and this meant he wanted France and Holland and Belgium to be secure from any future German attack, as this made the Channel ports more secure, and so made Britain more secure. He also wanted Germany to lose its navy and to lose its colonies, thereby removing any continued threat to the British Navy and the British Empire. But Lloyd George did not want Germany to seek revenge. Following the successful Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, he also wanted Germany to act as a barrier in Central Europe against communism. And if it was impoverished by a harsh treaty, it might succumb to communism. He also knew that Britain, and indeed all of Europe, needed a strong German economy. He was particularly keen for Britain to trade with Germany as it had done before the war, when it was Britain's largest European trading partner, second largest in the world, as this would secure British jobs. So, should Germany lose the Rhineland, it would not be rich enough to buy British goods, whilst high reparation sums would also act as a check on German economic recovery. Consequently, Lloyd George wanted to try and strike a balance between the punishment that was expected by the British and French people with the longer-term need for a strong Germany for both economic and political reasons, as well as the fear of a Germany out for revenge. In much of this, Lloyd George was close to President Wilson's views, but he was concerned about a number of matters that Wilson supported. Self-determination might be a useful guiding principle for the territories of the collapsed Austro-Hungarian Empire, though even here it was fraught with difficulties, how to deal with mixtures of people and how to make states economically viable. But it was a dangerous principle when it came to the British Empire, and for that matter, to the mandates being proposed to deal with the German and Ottoman empires. Similarly, he was worried about the principle of free access to the seas. Control of the seas was very important to Britain in order to control its empire, and if necessary, blockade an enemy. And the League of Nations was also a concern. Lloyd George didn't want Britain being committed to policing the world. It had enough on its plate, thank you very much. So to America. The American experience was very different to that of France and Britain. It had not entered the war until April 1917, and it would take a year before it was fully involved. Consequently, it had lost few men compared to France and Britain, 58,000. Still, it had made a sacrifice, and for a war that it rightly considered to be a European affair. But it hadn't suffered the losses that France and Britain had. In fact, it's fair to say that American business and industry did well out of the war, supplying arms and capturing markets formerly supplied by European countries. Consequently, Woodrow Wilson wasn't influenced by the emotional baggage that bore down on Clemenceau and Lloyd George. And Wilson was an idealist. He wanted to build a better and more peaceful world. He wanted nations to cooperate and to secure a fair and lasting peace. Self-determination, democracy, and an international organisation would be the basis by which this could be achieved. Wilson felt that democracy was the best way to ensure peace, as people would not want war, and he also believed in self-determination, which meant that people who identify themselves as a nation should be free to govern themselves and choose their own institutions. He also wanted an international body, a League of Nations, that would openly discuss problems. He came to the peace conference armed with his 14 points. They were, in effect, a set of solutions to what Wilson saw as the causes of the war. For example, he sought to replace secret alliances with open negotiations in the League of Nations. Wilson genuinely wanted to achieve a fair and lasting peace settlement, with the new international body, the League of Nations, overseeing interstate relations and hopefully disarmament. He sincerely believed that self-determination and democracy could only help in this. Wilson's idea of some kind of international body to ensure world peace was critically important. It was really the centerpiece of his 14 points. It would strengthen relations between countries and encourage international cooperation, not only in keeping the peace, but in dealing with humanitarian concerns and in facilitating business relations and trade between countries, all of which would surely strengthen democracy. And if in the future the treaties showed themselves in need of revision, then the League would be able to oversee the negotiations. He didn't want unnecessary pain inflicted on the defeated countries either, and he didn't want them seeking revenge. He wanted countries to cooperate to achieve world peace. At the same time, he was convinced that by building what he was sure would be a better and more peaceful world, it could only help America prosper, as trade would increase. So, there you have it. Different experiences, different views, different aims. I hope you found this presentation useful and that it helps you not only understand why the big three had different aims, but why the treaties were a compromise. I do thank you for listening, and I remind you to check out my website, History Made Easier. And if I've piqued your interest, you might consider my ebooks on Amazon. Cheers.